Hello and welcome back to my channel. So in today's tutorial I will be showing you how to cut and sew a short pencil skirt. Please watch to the end of the video. Please, if you have not subscribed to my channel, click on the subscribe button to subscribe. Also give this video a thumbs up and share with your friends. And also click on the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you. So I'll be cutting the front and the back together, and I've folded both the front and the back fabric into two using the biggest body circumference, that's quarter of my hip circumference plus extra 1.5 inches. And for the back I folded, but I marked out 2.5 inches before the center back for vent and for zipper allowance. And for the length of my skirt, the total length of my skirt is 21 inches, but I removed 1.5 inches for the band, so I have 19.5 on fold. Starting from the start line I drew on top to where the skirt, the length of the skirt is 19.5 inches. So to get the hip line, I will place my tape on where there is 1.5 inch mark on my tape. I'll place that on the start line, which is also the waistline, and I'll measure to 9 inches. That is where my hip line is. So I'm noting that. I'll place the tape on the 1.5 because I'm removing 1.5 for the band. So I would place and mark out 9 inches at different points, and then rule across this line, and that will be my hip line. On my waistline, I'll impute quarter of my waist measurement plus 1 inch for that, and my waist measurement is 29 inches, so quarter of that is 7.25 plus extra 1 inch for that will make it 8.25. So I imputed, starting from the center front, I imputed 8.25 on the waistline. Then on the hip, I will impute quarter of my hip measurement. My hip measurement is 39 and quarter of that is 9.75. So I'll impute 9.75 on my hip line. And then I would use my ruler to connect from the waist to the hip, the measurements I've taken. So now that I've taken these measurements, the next thing I will do will be to take the seam allowance for sewing this. So on the waist, I will add 1.5 inches seam allowance, and also on the hip line, I'll add 1.5 inches seam allowance. So the same seam allowance you add on the waist is the same thing you add on the hip line. So after adding this, I would also connect these two measurements together using a curved part of my ruler. So now, since I'm making a pencil skirt, I would measure what I have on my hip, the total measurement I have there, and from that measurement I'm going to subtract either 1.5 inches or 1/4 inches. So I decided to remove 1.25 inches, that is 1¼ inches, from the total measurement I have. The total measurement I have on my hip line is 11.25 inches. So on the hem line, I imputed 10 inches. I'm imputing 10 inches on the hem line. So I would then connect from the line running from where the seam allowance is. I would connect from the hem down to that point to join the hip to the hem. So I would connect the points together. So after connecting, I'm blending out the hip area to make sure that it is not sharp and everything is well blended. So after blending out, I would measure 2 inches. I would use a hemming allowance of 2 inches for the skirt. You can use any allowance you want, 1 inch, 2 inches, or even 3 inches or more. So I'll take 2 inches hemming allowance for the skirt. So I would now extend the line I have on the hem, the length of the skirt, down to my hemming allowance. With that, I will impute half of my bust span measurement, which is 4, on the waistline, and then for the length of the dart, I would come up from the hip line by 2.5 inches for the front dart. For the front skirt dart, I came up by 2.5 inches, and then I would connect to the 4 inches I have. the from the center front I measured 4 inches. That is half of my bust span measurement. So I would connect the points, then the dart will stop 2.5 inches before the hip line. So I will take half inch on both sides of this line I just ruled, and then connect it to the point I've made 2.5 inches before the hip line. That is how long the front dart will be. Since I will be connecting, joining a band to this skirt, so I will take from my start line, I'm going up by half inch to take half inch joining allowance. This allowance is for joining the band, the skirt band to the skirt. So I've connected this back to the skirt. So before cutting out, I'll go through my measurements once again to make sure that I have everything that I added and took all necessary measurements. Then after checking that, I'll then cut out the skirt. I'll cut out before working on the zipper side for the back and the vent as well, and also there will be an alteration on the waist side for the front skirt, but I'll first trim out these before working on both the front and the back, doing some alterations on both the front and the back parts. So now that I have cut out the front and the back, so now I would work on the back for the zipper and the vent, zipper allowance and the vent. So I'm redrawing the hip line on the back part of the skirt. I would redraw the hip line and all the other lines I have on the front part. I will try to recreate that to enable me take out my dart for the back part of the skirt. So I have drawn out the hip line. So I would also draw out the line, the start line before the joining allowance for the band. I will also rule out that line so it will be visible. From the center back before the 2.5 inches allowance, I would take half of my bust span like I did in front. I'll also note that on the hip line and connect. Then from the hip line for the back dart, I would come up by 2 inches. So the back dart will stop 2 inches before the hip line. I also took half inches on both sides of this line and I'm joining it back to the 2 inches I came up by, and that is that for the back dart. So I'm checking my measurements. I noticed that the hip line isn't straight, so it's as if the hip length is not correct. So I'm noting that. I'm placing my tape on the 1.5 inches point to the start line and redrawing to make sure that the hip line is up to 9 inches. So I'm checking and everything is correct. So the next thing I will do now will also to note the 2 inches hemming allowance I added to the skirt. I will be drawing that out. I'll be drawing out that 2 inches hemming allowance. So now I would measure the length of my vent starting from the line, um, the real measurement of length of the skirt from the 2 inches line I just measured. So the length of the vent depends on how short the skirt is. For me, this skirt is above my knee, so I don't want the vent to be too long, so I will take 5.5 inches length of vent. So I'm measuring 5.5 inches. So from the line before the hem allowance, I measured 5.5 inches. From this 5.5 inches I've noted, from that point upward I would measure 1.5 inches for my zipper allowance. So this will be the allowance for the zipper allowance. So I'm taking 1.5 inches up and I've joined them together. As you see, I've measured from that point, 5.5 inches point upward. I measured from the center back 1.5 inches up and joined all these points together. Now I will cut out this part that I have joined. I will cut out starting from that from the 5.5 inches line. But before then, from that point, I will still come in by half an inch. I'll come in by half an inch and reconnect it to the 1.5 inches line I've already ruled. I'll reconnect it up about 2 inches before the hip line. That's how I'll reconnect it, and then I'll cut out this point. I'll cut out, as you see, this other part. I'll cut out only the vent area that will be total of 2.5 inches allowance, while the zipper part is 1.5 inches allowance. I'll also split open the vent side. So I will then use this back part to cut out the lining for the back part. I'll cut out the lining, but the lining will be shorter than the main fabric. So I will go ahead and notch where my dart is. I'll also notch my zipper allowance to enable me know the point where the dart is. I would notch there and also notch the zipper allowance. So for the front part, I told you I will be doing a little bit of modification. So from the center front, because of the stomach region in front, I would come down by 0.75 at from the center front, and I'll use a curve ruler to connect it back to the main where the measurements for the front stopped before the side seam allowance. So I'll connect as you see me demonstrating, and then I would cut out this part. I would cut out what I have measured. 0.75 I removed from the center front and reconnected to the edge before the side seam allowance, and then I'll cut out. I'll also use the front center front to cut out the lining for the front piece. So I've cut out the lining for the back, and as you can see, it is shorter than the main fabric by 3.5 inches. I also did the same for the front. I also used the front to cut out the lining, and it's also 3.5 inches shorter than the main fabric. So what I'll do next will be to sew in my darts for the skirt and also for the lining pieces for both front and back. Then I've also cut out the band I would join to the skirt. I ironed interfacing to it. On fold, I have 2 inches. Open is 4 inches of width, and I've ironed interfacing to it, and I ironed in one part of the 1/2 inch for joining and left one part open. And the length of this band I've cut out is the length of my waist plus extra 3 to 4 inches of length. So this is my back. I've used the lining piece to turn out after sewing in the darts. So I placed right sides facing each other, and I've sewn, as you can see. I've sewn and also sewn the hem parts. I sewed using 1/2 inch seam allowance. I did that for both parts. So I will turn it out, the inside out, and then iron properly. I've also done the same thing for the front parts. So this is what I have after turning out and ironing. This is what I have for the back. So I'm placing the back parts one against the other, right sides facing each other, to mark out where my zip will stop. So I'll bring my zip. This is an 8 inches length of zip. So I would place to mark out, to note out. I'm placing my zip on the skirt to mark out where I want my zip to stop. So I want the length of the zip to be 8 inches. So I will go ahead and note 8 inches on my skirt. So from that point, I will sew using 1 inch. I'll join together. I'll sew using 1 inch. I'll sew down as you see me show, and then close to the vent side, I would come down by 1/4 of an inch and sew then towards the vents and join them together. So I have joined just like I described. I've also sewn in my zip. I've sewn in, you can see how at the vent it formed a 90 degrees from the line coming from the zipper allowance side. So I would notch that point. I'll notch that point very close to the seam I've made. I'll notch very close so that the vent can actually move left and right. Then I'll iron open the seam up. Then for the vent side, I would place the vent from the back side. I'll place it to the left hand side and then sew. So joining the vents and the main fabric. I'll sew it towards the main fabric, so that I'll sew it in such a way that the right side of the skirt, actually the vent is overlapping on the right side. So the right side will be overlapping the left side. So I'll place that vent on the side towards the right side and sew together. Then after doing that, I would hold the skirt together, the front and the back, using 1-inch seam allowance. So I have joined the skirts by the side using 1-inch seam allowance, and I've also held the vent in place just like I explained. So next thing I will do now will be to sew the band, and that will be the last. That would be conclude my making this skirt. So I've turned my skirt out. I'm cutting out the excess I have for the zipper. Then I would pin my the band I would pin the side that I left up open without folding in. I'll start sewing from the right side of my band is touching the wrong side of the skirt. That's the inner part of the skirt. So I'm pinning. Before I started pinning, I left about 1.5 inches length of the band before I started pinning from one end of the skirt. So I'll pin all round and I'll sew them together using 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I pin to the other end, I'll sew together using 1/2 inch seam allowance. So after sewing using this 1/2 inch seam allowance, the part that I left before I started pinning, I would turn them right sides facing each other, just as you see me demonstrate, and use 1/2 inch to tidy up that part before I fold back in, and then turn to the right side and also sew on that part that I folded in. I will sew on top, that's top stitching to the right side to finish up the band. So I have attached my band. So the next thing now will be to attach eye and hook to the back part. I've done everything, so I would use thread and needle to attach eye and hook to the band part. Thank you guys for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you have not subscribed, and also click on the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you, and see you in my next video. Bye.